This is Total Retail Tech Insights.
The content retail executives need to optimize their use of technology throughout their organizations.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Total Retail Tech Insights. I'm Joe Keenan, Editor-in-Chief of Total Retail, and I am joined on today's show by Scott Stone, the Vice President of Business Development at Sift. Thanks for joining me today, Scott.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be here. Great to meet you.
Yeah, so to get us started, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about Chargeback and how it can help retailers? I mentioned Chargeback because Sift recently acquired Chargeback. So tell us a little bit about that acquisition and how the acquisition can help bolster Sift's overall offerings.
Definitely. So Sift is a fraud platform, machine learning platform that detects user behaviors, tracks thousands of different events on the front end of an e-commerce transaction, preventing true fraud. So people trying to use stolen credit cards, doing scam and phishing attacks. There's a lot of use cases for Sift, but they all do center around fraud prevention. And on the back end of that, there is an entirely other ecosystem of managing cases of fraud that have taken place. And it's not necessarily that the front end tool didn't catch it. It's that on the back end, there's accidental cases of fraud committed by users. Chargeback was purpose built to manage the back end. And the acquisition from Sift's perspective was an extension of its suite of solutions for merchants and their other users to really provide an end-to-end service, everything that they do on the front end, as well as managing the back end. And then there's some synergies that came out of that. It all started with a partnership years ago and has grown into this new relationship.
Yeah, that's it's really exciting. And as you mentioned, this new relationship. Tell me a little bit then specifically about your role, Scott. How has it maybe have changed a little bit or possibly it's still the same following the acquisition earlier this year?
Well, Sift is a significantly larger company than Chargeback. And I joined Chargeback 5.5 years ago to pivot the company from its former self. Chargeback was founded as a business process outsourcing model. So the company would take this dispute and chargeback management work that merchants have to do. They would take it on and do it themselves. And there was significantly more people at the company, but the goal was to pivot it. And my role at that time with joining was really just framing out the pivot and setting a new go-to-market strategy for the company. I worked very closely on the product with the engineering teams, established the marketing team, and there was a heavy operation team, but this was my initial role. I moved over to strictly do marketing and sales as we launched the product and went to market and iterated on how we would present it and position it. It was brand new in the space at the time. The idea of using what we decided to do, which was a SaaS-based platform instead of an outsource approach, was net new in the industry. And so we had a lot to learn on messaging and positioning and empowering internal teams. But ultimately, my role shifted from strictly marketing into strategy. When the acquisition took place, I was the Chief Strategy Officer of Chargeback, focused predominantly on strategic partnerships and just more of a high level input on product and sales and operations. At Sift, I'll be doubling down on the partnerships front, focusing exclusively on those strategic relationships, our partnership ecosystem, and that's what I'll be doing moving forward.
So that's a great overview. So let's kind of dive into the topic of chargeback and fraud. So you mentioned that there are different types of chargebacks. Tell us a little bit about what you're currently seeing in the retail market when it comes to chargebacks.
Well, most chargebacks are related to fraud. There's really four main categories of chargebacks. You have fraud, which often represents 70% of a merchant's overall chargebacks, but that depends on the nature of their business. If they're a subscription business, it might not be as high. If they're a luxury good, it might be significantly higher. But then there's another large bucket called consumer disputes. They're not fraud disputes, but they're very common terms like not as described, not received. Perhaps the audience would benefit briefly from just a definition of chargebacks.
Yeah, that might be.
As a baseline. There's a really important underlying feature of a credit card. This is created by Visa and MasterCard and adopted by all card issuers, and it's the ability to have liability protection for when your card's compromised. In other words, as a consumer, if I freely use my card online or in stores or anywhere, and the merchant either writes down the number and uses it maliciously or doesn't protect or store the data in a secure environment and it gets leaked, I'll be protected from purchases I didn't authorize or make. Without that guarantee, its adoption would have been very difficult over the last number of decades. Your willingness to stick your card number in any form online, interact with a merchant that you've never worked with, really the underpinning of that confidence and that security is the fact that the networks guarantee that if something bad happens, you'll be taken care of. And that goes beyond just fraud and third parties compromising cards and using them maliciously. Also, if the merchants are sort of fraudulent or disingenuous with their behavior, you have this whole world of consumer disputes, which in summary is I interacted with a merchant and I agreed to buy something. We had a contract and they didn't fulfill it. It could be because the goods were, less than satisfactory. Maybe you agreed to buy a silk dress and you got a, plastic polyester one. There's a lot of different scenarios that could take place, but there's protection there, and that's the point of it. And then there's rules. There's a couple other categories that have to do with just the processing of transactions, as well as obtaining authorization to use a card. And there's so many different rules associated with the networks. They have hundreds of pages dedicated to accepting and processing credit cards, and equal number of pages in their rules and regulations dedicated to this chargeback process. And under the processing errors and the authorization issues, you have a significantly less number of disputes that we see from a merchant perspective, but nonetheless are required to handle. So having an understanding of all four buckets is important, but without a doubt, the largest is fraud for sure.
So within the kind of retail landscape, particularly within the last year plus, obviously more digital transactions, more digital payments. Has that correlated to increases in chargebacks, I would imagine, and to your point with the vast majority of them being fraud?
Absolutely. The rise in e-commerce transactions has resulted in a significant increase in the number of chargebacks. Just a few years ago, the mix was something around 90% in-store, what we call card present transactions, and 10% digital or card not present transactions. Card not present can include telephone orders, which was very common years and years ago, but it's more commonly mobile apps and websites, and but underneath that is a chargeback rate, and they're very different between those two environments. In the retail environment, where you had magnetic stripes, and then now we have EMV, and was hard to replicate. It got very easy for fraudsters. With EMV, it's significantly more difficult to replicate, though it is possible. You would end up with fraud chargeback rates and just chargeback rates in general in a retail environment of around 1 to 3 basis points for a merchant. And on the flip side with e-commerce, that number is easily 10 to 20 times higher. And so this has pretty serious implications when you have an acceleration like you did over the last 18 months in e-commerce. We went from, right around 15% e-commerce, sort of transaction volume as it related to retail, up to 50% very quickly. The majority of transactions were being made in a digital environment. The reason why it has such a higher chargeback rate is because it's easier to use stolen credentials in the e-commerce environment, in the digital environment. And there's also no liability or guarantee protection for a merchant like there is with EMV. I mean, I take that back. There is mechanisms. There's a digital version of EMV called 3DS, but adoption and usage of it isn't as commonplace as EMV is in retail. But ultimately, what you have, and the math is interesting, is you have a majority of transactions coming out of retail, but you have the majority of disputes and dispute dollars taking place in e-commerce, even though it only represented a fraction of the overall transaction volume. That 15% transaction volume share actually contributed 75% of the dispute volume share. It was very lopsided. And with COVID and with the acceleration of e-com, it blew up tremendously.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. And that 15%, there's no signs that number is going to stop there. It's going to continue to rise. So you would expect that those fraud chargebacks would accelerate as well. So it really speaks to the increasing importance of this topic. So one of the particular types of fraud I wanted to address with you, Scott, is friendly fraud and how that may pertain to chargebacks. And then kind of a second part to that is that, are there friendly fraud reason codes? That's often talked about. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, I'd love to. It's unfortunately a common misconception. There are no friendly fraud reason codes, but we should define friendly fraud quickly. When we're talking about chargebacks, there's obviously many forms of fraud, but when we're talking about fraudulent use of credit cards, the most common scenario is a third party using it, whether they've purchased a compromised set of cards or they've just picked it from a single wallet from a single person. The usage of that card is by a third party, and that is fraud. That is true credit card fraud. Then there's another version, which is first party fraud, and that would be you, Joe, committing fraud as the purchaser using your own credit card. And how that works is you can right now call your credit card issuer or your bank and let them know that you didn't make one of those purchases you made recently, up to 6 months ago. So if you're having a little bit of buyer's remorse, say on a large purchase that really hasn't met your expectations, it's not eligible for a return anymore. You've been using it, even though you're not really satisfied with it. You can commit fraud by calling the bank and saying, I never bought that. I'm just seeing this now. I don't know what this is. And you're the person committing fraud. That is, the definition of friendly fraud. It's maybe not the greatest term because it's not real friendly, but there is a friendly version of it. And I'm happy to use the term friendly fraud when it's a pure accident. Now, if you were to make that same phone call to your bank and you genuinely didn't remember the purchase because you forgot, maybe you did buy it, but then shortly after receiving it, or maybe someone else in your house actually accepted the package and then set it off to the side, and someone threw a code on it, and that was that. A month went by and nobody even knows it's sitting there in the foyer, and you accidentally file a chargeback. I'm happy to call that friendly fraud. You are committing first-party fraud in that scenario, but there's no malicious intent behind your actions. It's the former that is, really another form of fraud, and that's chargeback fraud. The fraudulent use of your chargeback rights to defraud a merchant.
Yeah, I know, to your point, kind of a misnomer there, particularly from the merchant's perspective. There's nothing friendly about that. So a good point you raise. So as we're having this conversation, we're right in the middle, or almost really closing in on the end of the back to school shopping. Well, not the end. We still have another month or so left. But the back to school shopping season, one of the busiest times of the year for retailers and merchants. So my question is, do you foresee increased levels of fraud, chargeback fraud, particularly friendly fraud during this time? And how might that manifest itself?
I do. Yeah, there's a couple things at play during back to school. One is just a common math problem. Whenever you have an acceleration in volume, which is a great thing, this is a great time to do sales. It's a great time to have a lot of traffic, have a lot of hits on the site. But because chargebacks are a percentage of your overall transaction volume, as your volume goes up, so does your quantity of chargebacks. So you're going to have a bigger amount to deal with during this time. Not necessarily during the time, in August and early September, you're going to see the transaction volume grow. But then the lag behind that is the chargeback influx. So on the heels of that, in October, you have a big spike in chargebacks, and that's related to volume. The other thing at play, which we saw a ton of in COVID, is the willingness to commit fraud, this form of chargeback fraud or friendly fraud, because of financial stress. There's very common stress during back to school time to get your kids dialed in, to spend beyond your means a bit. And while some consumers can afford to do that, not everyone can, and it can lead to knowingly filing chargebacks against purchases that you probably shouldn't have made. And there's a spike that results from that. It's unfortunate, but it is very much a reality. It happened a lot on the onset of COVID. People lost their jobs. They had to continue to make payments. For people that knew and understood, they could call the bank and file a chargeback. There was an uptick in it, and it makes sense why, but it is unfortunate.
Yeah. So right on the heels of back to school will be kind of the start of the Q4 holiday shopping season. There's probably, like you were just saying, we'll probably see a spike in friendly fraud over that time period as well, in that kind of shopping event. So my question for you, Scott, is, with that in mind, what are some of the things that merchants can do to avoid that friendly fraud and other types of chargeback fraud? And how can Sift help with those efforts?
You're right. Very, very much similar situation. It's often called, the chargeback season. Really starts in earnest mid-December and goes through January and February. There's a tremendous spike, corollary to volume, but also, can be tied to living beyond your means, making a lot of purchases, not remembering all of them. There's a lot of things that feed into the increase in chargebacks. And Sift does, first and foremost, a tremendous amount of automation. These are technology platforms that have been joined together to automate sussing out fraud on the front end, which prevents chargebacks, genuine chargebacks, true fraud chargebacks, from ever materializing, as well as deep vetting of interactions that a customer is doing on the website. And so when you have a case of friendly fraud or chargeback fraud, taking that information that you used to approve their order and providing it to your issuer programmatically, to the merchant, to the cardholders, issuing bank or the card issuer, is a pure automation opportunity, and that's what Sift is delivering to its merchants, and that is a lot better than hiring temp workers, scaling up chargeback management teams, paying extra per dispute fees to various BPO vendors, which, Chargeback used to be when I first joined, and I know how that works firsthand. So you can really manage the cost and be operationally efficient. The caveat is, though, it's all about planning and preparation. You can't enter the chargeback season, January, February, and call Sift. You won't be, it won't be implemented. It won't be, the data, the plumbing won't be configured. The data won't be flowing, and the automation won't take place in that environment. So, now is the time, and often the holiday freeze for merchants is a fantastic time to implement Sift. Sift dispute management specifically, because it doesn't sit in front of checkout. It presents no friction to the checkout process or the buying experience of a consumer. It's all back-end data. What did they do? Where was it sent to? When did they log in? Have they used it? Did they download it? What are their touch points? It's all post-transaction data that you need to aggregate and automate back to the issuers. And so you have, through the holidays to get it up and running, but you really want to have it done. And again, the caveat is you've got to be ready to go come January. And in this case with back to school, we're right in that time where you really should have had it up and running, because you're going to have to deal with these back to school chargebacks in earnest over the next month at this point.
Yeah. And then to your point, there's really, which is always a concern of retailers, there's no real impediment to the customer experience. To your point, this is kind of in the behind the scenes. This is post-transactional, so it's not impacting the purchase journey there at checkout.
Correct. Yep. Yep.
So let's talk about kind of any outside spikes in volume, in purchase volume. Is friendly fraud always going to be a problem in those instances?
Yeah, friendly fraud is part of doing business. You cannot predict when someone's going to forget that they made a purchase. That's a no-brainer, right? But you also can't predict whether or not they're going to have some malicious intent or try to defraud you through the chargeback system. You really have to, is it their card? Are they a first party user? And if so, you need to allow them to buy. It's all about order acceptance. First and foremost is order acceptance. You want that as high as possible. You want to accept 100% of the people trying to transact with you. But then you got to walk that back a little bit, because you know that 100% are not legitimate. So you got to be, laser precision with those that are not. There's a problem in the industry which is we call false positives, which is when you positively identify a good user as a fraudster and you don't let them transact. It's a big problem in the industry, and denying good customers has a cascading effect. Obviously, you lose the lifetime value when you block them, you send them somewhere else. You lose any referrals they might provide. It's a major issue to not accept money, but it goes beyond just not accepting that one order. Reducing false positives is very important. What Sift does with machine learning is constantly iterate on the users it is approving and the users it is denying. One of the critical components to that data set is whether or not someone filed a chargeback, but more importantly, whether or not the person that filed that chargeback did it because of true fraud or did it because of friendly fraud. Another mistake that's happening in the marketplace right now is MLs being fed just raw fraud chargeback data without any delineation between whether or not it was true fraud or friendly fraud. And there's another cascading problem there. When you feed the friendly fraud back into the machine, it then is being told to model off of these first party users. And that over time can increase false positives. which is a step in the wrong direction. You want to always be accepting more orders. You want to be pushing that number towards 100% constantly. So getting the data back into the ML that is more ground truth, more definitive, this is true fraud versus this is a clear case of friendly fraud, is very powerful to those acceptance rates. And making sure you're only blocking bad users and not blocking any good customers. With that said, there's always going to be people who forget or are malicious. They're first-party users. You want to let the first-party users through. And if they do file a chargeback, which they have the right to do, and there can be, again, financial concerns, there can be a lot of things at play here. You want to provide a solid case back through the networks to the issuer. It almost becomes like a little mini court battle. You build a case, you send it back in, and the issuer reviews it and either awards that customer their money back, which they've actually already done, they let them keep it, or they reverse it and give it back to the merchant, which is what you're going for in those cases of friendly fraud. You want to show the issuer that, hey, they did actually make that purchase. They may have forgotten it, or they may be, malicious with their intent, but they absolutely made it was them. And the issuers want to know that information too. It's good for them.
Yeah. So for this question, Scott, let's take the consumer out of the equation, if it's possible to do that in this conversation, and just focus in on the retailer's perspective for a second. Why, from the retailer's perspective, why not just get rid of chargebacks altogether? Talk to kind of what the potential value that chargebacks can offer retailers and merchants.
Well, it's a common goal. I want to have zero chargebacks. And it's that concept has matured a lot in its understanding. Just a few years ago, you would hear companies talking about zero chargebacks and not getting any chargebacks. And you have companies guaranteeing no fraud chargebacks. I'm paying you back when you do get them. The problem with that is circles back to what we were just talking about. You're going to have to block some good users to prevent 100% of chargebacks. Now, that's a bad thing in and of itself. But if you go even a step further and try and make an argument that the networks themselves, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, et cetera, should remove the chargeback process or the chargeback rights, then you're going to have a lot less comfort transacting online and in these digital channels. And that's going to be horrible for business way beyond just trying to not get chargebacks. There really is a tremendous benefit and reason why this chargeback ecosystem, these rights even exist. And as a merchant, you want that in place. You want good cardholders to be able to have a backup plan if something goes wrong, not because you want to have to deal with it when something goes wrong. That's obviously going to be tough on your business. But you want them to transact and you want them to feel comfortable transacting, knowing that they're protected. And that's more important for your business. So do I think chargebacks will go away, or is there some sort of silver bullet where they're removed from the ecosystem? Absolutely not. I think a payment network that doesn't have a chargeback mechanism is set up to fail. And
to your point, in this particularly digital world, that trust and comfort level of the consumer is going to be paramount and critical to the success of any retail business going forward.
Yeah.
So this has been a really great conversation. I want to take the opportunity before we wrap up, Scott, for those in the audience that are interested in learning more about this topic, as well as how Sift might be able to help their businesses, where would you direct them?
I would just direct them to sift.com. Head over to the website, and there's a fantastic blog. One of the founders and the CEO contributes tremendous thought leadership to it. The team itself is constantly doing research. Sift is on a mission to help everyone trust the internet. And through that, they're constantly researching ways, not just to minimize fraud, but to detect it earlier and earlier and reduce friction for good buyers and dynamically introduce friction for bad behavior. And there's a tremendous amount to just read about. And then there's a whole team of people available to chat with. Sift actually has a dedicated team called the Trust and Safety Architects that are just consulting all day long with clients, prospects, customers, industry partners, you name it, industry thought leaders. Kevin Lee on our team led the Trust and Safety team, which is the team that manages fraud at Google and Facebook. And he has a team of just exceptional experts that are available for folks to learn from and lean on to be better, to improve their unique situations in their environments, regardless of their industry or the attacks that they're facing or the threats they're facing. So I would just, honestly go to sift.com and start a conversation or relationship. There's a tremendous amount of people that can help you.
Yeah, that's some great information on how Sift really can be a resource for our audience. So I want to take the opportunity to thank Scott Stone, again, the Vice President of Business Development at Sift, for joining us on today's episode of Total Retail Tech Insights. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on this podcast, please check out our podcast channel page at mytotalretail.com/podcasts for show notes. Tech Insights is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. Make sure to subscribe on our podcast channel page as well. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a few moments to rate and review this podcast. Thanks, and until next time, this has been Total Retail Tech Insights.